Salam, namaste, vanakkam, hetepu, molweni, and welcome to this Sunday's edition of The People's Voice, produced and presented by your host, Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed, for Salaamedia, your humanitarian journalism platform and portal. We're broadcasting live from eThekwini, Durban, KZN, South Africa. Welcome to the show. Before I introduce our topics and guests in this bumper 2-hour edition this evening, let's help you tune into what is going to be a robust and critical conversation this evening. So you can comment, ask our guests questions, and of course, share your thoughts and ideas. Here's how we can get connected. You can join us in one of about 10 ways. You can watch via the Salaamedia Facebook page, the YouTube account, Twitter or Instagram, the Salaamedia website, or the SoundCloud website. Look for Salaamedia. And of course, via the Salaamedia or TuneIn app and all free-to-air decoders. Before we go any further, and to maximize interaction and engagement this evening, I'm going to start a watch party, which you can do as well from the Salaamedia page. So it's very easy. You look for the Salaamedia page on Facebook, and you will see the live video that's being broadcast already, and you click on share, you click on start watch party, and it's about as easy as that. All right, then the watch party will be screening on your personal profile. You can also share it to groups. I'm looking forward to a great, robust show this evening with some really brilliant guests. So let's tell you about the show. In the first half of the show from 6 to 7 p.m., we analyze the significance of Fees Must Fall to understand why we need activism. We hear responses to Adam Habib's inflammatory interview on Salaamedia earlier this week, and we discuss restorative justice for violence against the Fees Must Fall movement. That's 6 to 7 p.m. In the second half of the show, from 7 to 8 p.m., we debate, was indenture disguised, sanitized, or blatant slavery? We evolve our understanding of colonialism and imperialism's diabolical weaponry, and we ask where to from here for reparations for these crimes against humanity. So in the first half of the show, talking Fees Must Fall, let's welcome into the studio our guests, the social justice activist Sipho Singiswa.
Thank you, and
as
good
well
evening
as
to your viewers.
Welcome, Sipho Singiswa. It's an honor to have you on the show, as well as restorative justice lawyer Sheena saying Clair Jonker.
Thank you so much for having us.
Welcome to the show. It is wonderful to have you both on. I know Thobani is having some technical difficulties with his network, but we're hoping he's going to be able to join us very, very shortly. So Sipho Singiswa is an activist, social justice activist, as well as a filmmaker with Media for Justice. And of course, Sheena Jonker is an ADR practitioner and a restorative justice lawyer. Thobani Zikalala is an activist and a political commentator. We're hoping he's going to be able to join us shortly. We're going to begin the show by screening a Fees Must Fall film that has been made by Media for Justice, which is the organization of Sipho Singiswa and Gillian Skitter, before we take off our conversation today on Fees Must Fall. So Sadiq, you can play that video for us.
We understand this is a sociological question about black people having access to education and having economic freedom in our town.
We are living in a society where a broken window gets more attention than an injured black child who was burnt by a stun grenade exploding in her face while running to safety.
that we are going to move forward together and we're going to be unified with one call for free decolonized education now.
Basically, the South African Police Force Services has been reduced to being preoccupied with white supremacy corporate projects.
Comrades, Anglo-America alone can give us free education.
Government is bloody implicated by the reality that, you know, they are in power. 20 odd years later, they have not given free education.
University a banana republic. We will continue to shut down until we have free education. Fumanibo! Fumanibo! Fumanibo!
Yes, God.
And we're back after watching that film made by Sipho Singiswa and edited by Gillian Shitter. And we're going to bring both our guests back into the studio for this roundtable conversation on the significance of fees must fall, why we need activism, responding to Adam Habib's interview on Salaamedia last week, and discussing restorative justice for violence against the fees must fall movement. And I see we've got Thobani Zikalala in the house. Please unmute yourself, Thobani. Welcome to the People's Voice. All right, we can't hear Thobani. It might be your earpiece, Thobani. If you can please check with him, Sadiq, and ask him to remove his earpiece and see if that works while we get the conversation going. All right, so for those of us who've been involved with the Fees Must Fall movement, any visuals that we see reminding us of that time invoke some really intense emotions. I want to start with Sipho on this one. Tell us about your lived experience as a Fees Must Fall WITS filmmaker.
Well, if I can start by quickly saying, you know, I come from the 1976 student uprising leadership. So what the students were embarking on, I found myself in solidarity with them. First of all, as a member of the ANC who understands that at some stage, the ANC, now as the ruling government, had in its own doctrine promised free quality education. A couple of years down the line, when this wasn't happening, young people took to the streets because they understood the social impact of quality, equal access to education. And this wasn't happening. They took to the streets. Not everything that the students are arguing for, I could not agree with. You know, I'm a former Robben Island political prisoner. I'm an MK underground operative, and so on and so on, you know. After that sacrifice, here, young people were saying exactly 99% of what we were saying in 1976. I had to cover what was happening because I also understood that without people seeing and witnessing what was happening, these young people were going to be brutalized, in exactly the same fashion we were brutalized in 1976, going onwards until 1994. As a parent, I asked other people, where is their responsibility when they can allow young people to be brutalized for speaking nothing else but the truth?
Very powerful statement. Very, very powerful statement. And I'm sure your experience being on the ground amidst this campaign for justice was quite surreal in some ways. I mean, I know it was quite emotional, but what were your thoughts on the ground as you were filming these scenes and interviewing the students, Sipho?
Well, I was often in disbelief that, you know, my own comrades who were now in positions where they can make a difference to help redeem the self-esteem of the Black child, were not doing this. Instead, they were working in the opposite direction rather than helping these kids. And you know, one of the things that kept on coming out from the likes of Adam Habib and some government officials, I'm not going to mention their names, the so-called stalwarts were often coming, you know, on a red race to come and address the students to say, we support your fight for free quality education, but you have to do it within the ambit of the law. The question was, which law? The very same law that was brutalizing them. How do you then ask someone who's brutalizing you what means you should use to defend yourself, to fight for your rights, when that person will use all these legalities and legal jargon to continuously frustrate your authentic struggle?
Brilliant, that point there. And I know Sheena's been nodding, so I know we're going to get into whose law just now, but I want to get to Thobani. Can you hear me clearly, Thobani? Okay, we can't hear you though. Is your mic on mute or not? All right, it looks like you can hear me. Try to exit and come back, Thobani. Your voice is very important in this conversation, so we need for you to come back into the conversation. Restart your phone, that might help. Sheena, let's go to you. You've heard Sipho raise some very important points about whose law. But when you're watching this film that we've just seen just now, I mean, you're one of the legal practitioners, and there were many who stepped up to the plate, not nearly enough perhaps, who supported Peace Must Fall from both an advocacy as well as a legal perspective. When you watch this film, when you see those scenes, and I know you're based in KZN, but it's one struggle, what are the memories you're now reminded of? Sheena, can you hear us?
Let me unmute myself. Sorry, can you?
Perfectly clear.
Can you hear me, Shabnam?
Perfectly clear, Sheena.
Okay.
You go ahead.
So yeah, Tracy Lomax and myself through Access worked for around 15 months, I think it was, mobilizing as many lawyers and mediators as we could, primarily to protect legitimate student protests. So a lot of our time was taken up mobilizing lawyers to do bail applications, getting medical attention, insisting on medical attention, insisting on students being able to see legal representatives where they were being held in jail. So it does, those scenes bring back very surreal memories of, you know, in the middle of the night trying to get pastors to go out to some of the campuses I'm thinking of in the Western Cape to make a way for ambulances to get in, you know, and hearing that private security were drunk and you know, stories. We had a group of students in Limpopo that were were driven through the bushes in a police van. Kilometers. There was just, so it invokes a lot of real. We were very committed to protecting the voice of the students. We knew that we didn't understand the struggle in the depth that they did. And we were constantly amazed by the depth and the insight and the discipline. So we were there to try and create a hedge of protection around the students as they went out to protest. I mean, students don't get up in the morning to go and get shot with rubber bullets and sprayed with water cannons for fun. You know, this was very disciplined and very necessary action. And we often found ourselves just kind of lapsed in tears, just moved by what these students were kind of their commitment and that they were carrying, and it was layers and layers and layers of trauma, because many of these students were working from conditions where they didn't have adequate accommodation, they didn't have adequate, access to nutrition and all that kind of thing. That they were fighting to get through their degrees, but there are layers and layers of socio-economic problems that inform this whole thing. So just the courage and the bravery of what was amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was
Sheena, before we turn the mic over to Thobani, your quick comment on what Sipho had raised at the beginning of the show, which is, whose law is it anyway?
Well, that's a very good question, because we're now seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been led, as far as I can tell, by some very courageous Black females across the world. There's the abolish the police movement. Now, if you read books in defense of looting, and we want to do more. These are very good books, and the end of policing. These are very good books to understand the history of policing, and the policing that we have today in South Africa, as is in America, is rooted in white vigilante slave holding. It has its roots there. Our police that emerged today, that exists today, emerged out of white vigilantism, there to protect property and to ensure that slaves don't run away. And it's ironic if you look at the protests that have happened this year, the Clicks protests. The police are there in defense of property, aren't they? They're not there. I mean, something we really don't know where that comes from, but we don't know always how it happens. But that's what gets a rise out of people. That's what gets a rise out of people. But police can brutalize someone, especially the black body, and there isn't that kind of rise.
Sure. I'm hearing some feedback from the background. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but maybe mute your mic if you're not speaking, and that might help us out a bit. Thobani, can you hear me loud and clear? All right. Can you speak so I can see if we can hear you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Fantastic. All right. So I think you might have missed the film that we saw in the beginning by Media for Justice, Sipho Singiswa and Gillian Skitter, showing us what happened at Fees Must Fall. But of course, you were at UKZN, so you were in the center of the storm as well, and you know what happened. So whether you've seen the film or not, you'll be able to tell us, what was the experience like? What do you still remember? What memories will never leave you?
You know, I was just saying the other day, asking some of my comrades on Facebook whether it is bad to that in one maybe for someone to feel nostalgic at times, to rethink the fullest moment, right? And of course, when we rethink the fallist moment, I think in this country, the one mistake we do is we rethink the fallist moment and we go back only to fees must fall, right? We don't go back and trace at Thobani Makhwele's Act in Roads Must Fall in Cape Town, right? That gives rise to the fallist moment. And I think that is important because we cannot erase history. We cannot, when we rethink the fallist moment, go straight to without going through Roads Must Fall. And of course, Roads Must Fall Fees Must Fall is nothing without the Outsourcing Must Fall movement. So the fallist moment in its entirety must be remembered correctly. But to answer your question where you say, what do I remember? I remember two things. I remember the fact that in 2015, I was an unemployed young person who was not at a university, but on the 23rd of October, I was on the streets of Durban in solidarity with students at the time who were demanding free education. But I know that in 2016, I was a first year BA student at UKZN. And the first thing that I did, I think, when I arrived on campus was to look for this so-called fallist. And of course, I then became part of those who were organizing in the campus that I was at. What do we remember? We remember the violence, both physical and non-physical. We remember the state violence. We remember what it meant to arrive on campus peacefully singing to a police station, if I can say, to the armory of the state already organized against you. We remember the silence of many people in this country who we thought were justice-seeking people. We remember the fact that those who we thought were our allies turned against us. We remember being called barbaric and non-thinking kids when all we sought was to be given free education so that we could be able to shape where this country goes. Also, with the fallist movement, we remember how the whole country really just focused on free education and didn't hear the many nuances that we are raising. That we were raising the issue of the content that we are taught. We are raising the issue of the aesthetic and the structure of the university that we are in. That at that time, the fallist movement had drawn the line between the colonizer and the colonized, had drawn line between the settler and the native. And when we rethink Fees Must Fall in the fallist moment, we must always go back at the orientation of the Fees Must Fall movement in its ideological discourse, because every time we rush to the nice things, but we don't want to talk about what really were these kids demanding, right? So for me, I think about that. I think of the sacrifices. I think of my friends, my comrades who couldn't finish their degrees because the universities kicked them out. I think of Kanya Tsegesh, and I think of Mcebo Dlamini, I think of Bongos Kanyile, I think of many others. I think of those who lost their lives, right? And this country continued like nothing happened, right? But in the same breath, I think about the Fees Must Fall, about the fallist generation who post 2016 almost forgot their generational mission and life went on as if nothing has happened. I think of the fallist generation that is in parliament today, that is seeing the things that are still happening in the universities they come from, who the fallist moment raised them to the level that they are in today, but we don't hear their voice in the spaces of power. So I think of all these important things, and I say to myself, sometimes when I think, was it all worth it? But of course, fighting for justice is always something that we must always do.
One of the brightest young minds in our country. Thank you, Thobani, for that very moving and very evocative, robust points that you've raised there. And I see people are enjoying the conversation already. Good program. Thank you for the show. I think on question 2, I think we've spoken about some of this already. But if you haven't, here's a chance to highlight the significance of Fees Must Fall in its time and in 2020. And as a follow-up question, what has the movement contributed to activism in South Africa? Sipho, let's begin with you.
Well, it was actually, for me, as an activist, I struggle, sorry, just to say quickly, I struggle to keep saying I'm a former activist, because a lot of the issues, the social issues that I sacrificed my youth to try and fight to change, they still exist. I mean, we all know that rather than racism taking a back step, it's been getting bolder and bolder, racism acts and so on, we see that, but it's almost, when I say COVID-19 has done us a favor, those of us who've been ignorant for so long, and during apartheid time, they used to say, oh, I didn't know, because it wasn't in the news, it wasn't on TV, so we didn't know, but these issues that we were fighting to change, and we sacrificed, some of us sacrificed life and limb. We sacrificed time on Robben Island and so on. And yet today we have the Zondo Commission and so on. It talks, amongst other things, to a lot of what the students were talking about. We were all excited. I was very excited and saying, wow, what took so long to remind that older so-called stalwarts that they've been betraying our people, particularly the young people and so on. So Fields Must Fall helped to, to knock on our heads to say, what are we doing and so on. Hence, there was a lot of people from government, in particular from the ANC, trying to divert the core objective of Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall. Just before I stop, ask yourself a question. How is it possible that the kids are saying roads must fall, and our own so-called stalwarts are like busy, selling, pushing down the throats of the young people who are speaking the truth about the Rhodes Mandela Scholarship and so on, That is an insult to me, to actually engage in projects like that without any proper engagement and scrutiny of how these relationships come about. Hence today, we're having apartheid institutions. They are strong. Marikana happened. Guess what laws were being used? They were exactly the same security branch laws they used against us to deny people who were exercising their right, which is guaranteed in the so-called amazing constitution in South Africa. But it doesn't protect the poor. It doesn't protect the students who don't come from privilege. It doesn't help them access quality education. One of the reasons that is happening is because the whole system is a fraud. It continues being a fraud, and it only talks and markets all these great sounding policies and so on, but we know they are just marketing, election gimmicks and so on. Our kids have a right to demand genuine social change that gives them respect, that makes them feel they belong to this country. After all, this country belongs to them by birthright.
Absolutely. Sipho, I think you've raised some very compelling points there. I'm going to give Sheena a minute on the same question. Sheena, what's the significance of Fees Must Fall movement in its time and in 2020? And as a follow-up, what do you believe Fees Must Fall contributed to activism in South Africa? I think your mic is on mute, Sheena.
So what for me, it's difficult to do justice to it in a minute or two, but for me, it brought to the fore and it deepened my understanding on engagement, and how if we say everyone's invited, but everyone does not have the means to get there, then the everyone's invited is meaningless. So when we teach restorative justice to lawyers, we try to say, get away from treating or trying to problem solve the presenting injury. Contextualize the problem in its full context. So if you listen to the interview of Adam Habib, and I know you're going to get there, he's talking a lot about the violence you can see. Not talking about that's the presenting problem, that's the problem made manifest, but he's not talking about why is it so, and what is the context within which that lives. And if we don't have a understanding of these, and if we don't allow ourselves, and if we give ourselves permission to keep not contextualizing these issues, then we can just, you know, put a band-aid on it, paint a rainbow over it or whatever, and the wound is going to keep festering and getting worse and infecting everything around. So
Sheena, I want to pass the mic to Thobani very quickly, because we need to get to the Adam Habib video clip very, very quickly, because we're already halfway through the show. Thobani, what is the significance of Peace Must Fall in 2020, and what do you think it's contributed to activism in South Africa?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the Peace Must Fall movement is the highest point of youth political activism of the past decade. Its contribution, for me, the biggest contribution, is one, first, through the Peace Must Fall movement, historically we have been taught this, we have been taught this lesson, but through the Peace Must Fall movement, the important lesson we learned was that the oppressed must always be able to speak for themselves, to organize and think for themselves. The second thing was that when we are seeking justice and liberation as a people who are oppressed, the first thing that we must understand is that without the unity of the oppressed, we will never triumph over everything. I think it was beautiful to watch young people, black people of different walks of life, being able to be united around an idea. In 2020, when we look at the Peace Must Fall movement, I think the first thing we must look at is how have we lost that spark that united us? I mean, we are sitting with over 50% youth unemployment in this country. Like, if it is something that should be uniting us, it's such issues. But of course, we have gone back to the bickering about political formations, about personalities, about egos, and we have forgotten the essence of what we are fighting for. That at the end of the day, our activism is about justice, our activism is about liberation, and nothing more. For those of us who come from the BC tradition, we'll say it must always be all to the structure, all to the political power structure, and nothing against the people. But at this point in this country, what we have learned is that people are much more interested in seeing wrongs within the ranks of the oppressed than locating and correctly pointing out the oppressor of the people and the power and the political structure that renders us oppressed in this country, and directing all our energies towards that structure. So Peace Must Fall teaches us many lessons, but for students, activists, I think also it also teaches that there is nothing that we can do to change our situation in the universities if our activism does not speak about the political system and the political power and the political power structure that we find ourselves in. Because for many years, we've been marching for vice chancellors, right? But we have, it seems 2020, we are back at the idea of campus politics other than national politics that speak to the higher education sector. And of course, that must then lead us to the so-called power structures that run this country. We are in a situation in 2020 of a very neoliberal, arrogant administration that is very blatant in the fact that it is trying to entrench again in this country neoliberalism and, of course, the free market system of capitalism. If young people of this country don't really realize that We are in a very bad situation, and the only way for us to come out of this is through our unity. Of course, those who are older will then start talking about the many things that they've got to lose. We are poor, we are young, we are unemployed, we are almost, sometimes they even say we are unemployable, right? We can't go to school because of what this administration is doing to us and has been doing to us for the past 26 years. So what we should
Can I ask you to pause there? Can I ask you to pause there? We'll take a quick comment before we move on to the third of our 5 questions today, which is going to examine Adam Habib's interview recently. We've got a comment from Mohamed, and he says government also needs to look at the textbook costs. Authors release a new version every year. Students are forced to buy the new edition because it is the prescribed version or edition. All the author has done is change the color of the textbook, added maybe a few pages. My opinion, the textbooks are a big money maker for the authors. A lot of them are lecturers themselves. An edition needs to be valid for at least 4 years, and students should be allowed to sell used textbooks to the new intake. It's costing students thousands of rands. Every year, prices are just increasing and increasing. Neoliberal capitalism at its best. All right, so what we're going to do now is going to watch an edited version of an interview with Adam Habib that was on Salaamedia during this past week. Ideally, I'd edit it to about 10 minutes, but we don't have that kind of time to spare. Disclaimer, both Gillian Skitter, who is an activist filmmaker, and I asked questions on that show about accountability for state and private violence against students, which led to a fairly standard interview becoming rather heated and going off topic. I've not included parts of the interview where Gillian was dehumanized, but we're going to watch 3 clips back to back very quickly, and then we'll come back for your responses to these clips. Sadiq, let's watch them.
That a culture of violence emerges in 2 contexts. One is the structural context, when you have a society with deep level inequalities and deep level political and social polarization, then that society has a level of violence in it. So forget South Africa. If you look at why is the United States far more violent than Germany, part of it has got to do with the very, very deep inequalities in American society and the very, very deep social and political polarization in the society. So that clearly is a manifest and is evident in South Africa. And we have that. We have a history of violence. We have a history of violence by the apartheid state, and we have a history of violence against the apartheid state. And that has tended to create a culture where we glorify violence. So listen to how many young people kind of think it's so cool to be violent, or so cool to attack the police, or so cool to burn things. Look at the kinds of songs we sing and how we sing it, as if these are some things that we should be celebrating as contemporary activities, as opposed to those activities that were necessary under an apartheid system. So I think that that's there. But I also think that there's a lot of justification of violence. You would be amazed at how many young people say, well, you know, we are violent because there is structural violence, as if the presence of economic exploitation justifies the violence of individual actors. And by the way, that's amongst young people. I've met lots of young people who glorify violence, including young Muslim activists who've done so. And we often don't call them out. And I think they must be called out because they sit in kind of middle-class households, and then they can pretend that violence is kind of cool and adventurous. There are consequences for those violence. People die. People go to jail. And I think we must hold people accountable. People, you think I did something illegal? Take me to court. Let's see how far you go. We've been challenged in court time and time again. So don't give me the story of these pseudo-revolutionaries. Because my job as a vice chancellor is to make sure that teaching happens, that research happens, that people pass and they go on to become doctors and lawyers. WITS does that every single year. We do that because we've created a place of learning. It's one of the few institutions, public institutions in this country that works. So frankly, I don't care what pseudo-revolutionaries they say. What I want to know is, do I find it tragic that I had to call police in? Absolutely, I do. I find it tragic. And I ask myself, why did I have to be in a position to have done that? But let me be blunt. If anybody tries to burn WITS University, if anybody tries to assault my staff or my students, I will hold them accountable. Because we've seen politicians like Jacob Zuma and Ace Magashule and Julius Malema say one thing. They try and threaten our public institutions and destroy our environment. I am not prepared to allow this. And I don't get judged by whether politicians like me or political activists like me. I get judged by how many graduates I produce, how much research I produce. Is that financially sustainable? Have I transformed the people? I don't really care. I'm not here to please you. I'm here to make sure that I do the job I was mandated by the nation. And I would like more people to do that. So I'm sorry to be frank, but I'm way past pandering to what is really nonsensical, rhetorical gestures by people who've never built anything.
All right, welcome back to The People's Voice.
Yeah.
We're in conversation about the significance of fees must fall in relation to activism. We're responding to Adam Habib's interview, which we've seen a part of now. And we're talking about restorative justice for the violence against the fees must fall movement. I see we need to bring Thobani back into the conversation. Sade, can you just check where Thobani is? But I think he's coming back now. Let's give Adam Habib 5 minutes. Let's respond to him in about 5 minutes, and then we can move on from there. Sipho, you've watched this interview. You may have watched the extended 29-minute version, but there's some real gems in these 3 clips that we've just watched. What are your specific thoughts?
Look, first of all, what Adam Habib says about building something and producing so many graduates and so on, we have to also ask ourselves what type of quality these graduates he's talking about, Is he producing entities that just get delivered into neoliberal economic structures and so on, and he gets patted on the back, for being a good kitchen nigger, if you like, who's good in servicing. Now, let's ask the question, which also takes us back to the question that, what was contributed by fees must fall, amongst other things. The question is, the education approach that Habib talks about, what good is it if it doesn't strengthen democracy, if it doesn't speak to the issues of social justice, restorative justice? Is he happy? He talks about people living, and he talks including Muslim. Now he's already, in that mindset of racism, because in actual fact, Adam Habib's understanding of education is to deliver our people to the West, to the Western economic powers, to extend that, and I want him to take me to court, like he says he's older than us, he was in politics long before we were born. I'm much older than that kid, Adam Habib. So is my wife, Gillian. We are much older than him. We were active long before, he thought he could even say the word struggle and so on. Plus, there is absolutely, which explains why corruption exists in the institutions of learning in this country. It's people like Habib who keep making false claims about their involvement in the struggle and so on, when there's absolutely no evidence of that. I was in the struggle. I'm a veteran of the struggle. Robben Island, everything, I have seen it. I have never seen Adam Habib. And I know in our circles we were discussing how statements about him being denied access in America was actually used to justify his role to deliver our people to the Western powers, to the Ruperts and to the Harry Oppenheimers and so on, that he never speaks about. He's keen to talk about the Julius Malemas, the Zumas and so on, you know, but corruption was here long before Julius Malema and the Zuma were in power and so on. We need to address
All right, let's
that.
pause there. Let's pause there, Sipho, because we've got about 14 minutes to go. Is Thobani with us? Thobani, your thoughts on Adam Habib's interview, the gems in that interview?
Yeah, you must take me to court too.
Adam Habib must stop this idea where he thinks he must fight us for his part in the defense of white supremacy and its capitalist economic power structure. Adam Habib cannot claim to be someone who cultivates intellectual thought and whatnot when he's the same Adam Habib who organizes state violence and organizes violence at WITS to suppress dissenting views. Adam Habib, the first thing, the only easiest thing that Adam Habib can do is just to leave that WITS and go to London where he's going. Because for me, it is good riddance to someone who has been a very good soldier of making sure that neoliberalism is what you call entrenched. And I like what Sipho is saying, to say Adam Habib has written on this idea of him as a former activist and all that. But of course, we have not seen the fruits of this idea of Adam Habib as someone who fights for justice. Adam Habib speaks of the idea of violence and the glorification of violence. If Adam Habib was worthy of the salt of being at least a bit of a scholar, of an intellectual, now he would understand the idea of violence and how violence, what is violence in essence. Adam Habib cannot claim to be fighting violence when the very existence of WITS and its education is violence in itself. When Adam Habib...
Can I ask you a very specific question, Thobani? When you were on my show a couple of months back, we spoke about the role of private security, and of course, demand must exceed supply, right? So there has to be engineered acts of violence and buildings being burned to justify billions being spent in private security. Very specifically, talk to the role of private security at UKZN. Is there any evidence to show the students were behind it?
I repeat what I said months ago. Any investigation that they've ever done by the police, by the university and whatnot, has never brought evidence that students have ever burned in the building. And I want to ask Adam Habib and any other vice chancellor in this country, why is it that all their investigations have never brought forward students that are culprits in burning universities? Because all the time the narrative is that we are burning universities. They have no evidence of such, but of course, in a state where the powerless are trying to go against those who have power, it is the powerless who get blamed for everything. If in this country, we took time to study the political economy of protest, as I call it, you will understand the role, in particular in universities, the roles of those who stand to benefit when there is a crisis. Now we must ask ourselves, Vector Security at WITS, I think, MI7 at UKZN and many other security companies, what do they stand to gain when there's a crisis on campus? And what is their role in the things that happen on campus? We have had people at UKZN finding petrol bombs in funny places. You know, they say, no, we find petrol bombs there. And you eat funny places because the crisis benefits a lot of people. These so-called vice chancellors, they love the crisis. They create crisis every day. But because we are people who have at least try to gain knowledge in this unknowledgeable spaces they've created and called universities, we understand that capitalism survives through crisis. So this idea of the university that has been turned into a corporate institution which must make profits for people like Habib to earn millions and then turn their back, turn around and call us barbaric and call us violent, when the very oppression and exploitation of young people at universities, of lecturers, of support staff is how Adam Habib has been able to survive. So
yes, Thobani, let's pause there. Let's pause there. We've got 9 minutes. We've got 9 minutes and 2 more questions. Sheena, your response to Adam Habib. Sheena, can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
All right, your response to Adam Habib. We've got 9 minutes and 2 more questions. You've watched those 3 clips with Adam Habib. How would you respond?
Yes. So the first thing is for a vice chancellor of a university to make a sweeping statement that young people think violence is cool and it's adventurous is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. And not only is it ridiculous, but it's reckless. The second thing is he links the so-called justification to violence to be, he says, the students violence, economic exploitation. Well, economic exploitation is a violence. It is the violence. It's the originating violence. And the third thing that I wanted to say is that, what was it? No, it's escaped me now. But yeah, I just think he's complete. Oh, the third thing I wanted to say, of all the arson matters that access to justice was consulted in and fees must fall, there wasn't one where there was evidence of arson linked to a student, not one single one. And not one of the matters where we were consulted on behalf of a student, not one did those charges stick. They were trumped up charges. As Thobani said, you know, there would be petrol bombs hidden in see-through packets with a student card. A lot of these students are PhD students. They're not that stupid.
Sure.
And they're not going to hide their petrol bombs and rubbish bin.
And the media had a very significant role to play in this, because just like Marikana, the prevailing narrative of the corporate superstructure was what we saw in the media. The students were violent and evil. The minors were violent and evil. All right, I want to leave it there with Adam Habib, because I think we've got more important things to talk about.
Can I mention something quickly? Just quickly.
Very quickly, we've got 7 minutes.
Adam Habib is justifying the violence that he used to also hide the fact that amongst the security companies he was using, there were also former mercenaries from other countries and so on. And Habib, take me to court. Don't ask my wife. Take me to court, you know, because I will expose your lies about the reasons why the CIA, you know, prevented you from going. It was part of legitimizing your manufactured struggle credentials that don't exist and so on. So you use mercenaries and weapons of war in a campus environment, and you tell me that, you know, you've produced graduates and so on. For what? So they can also be selling their people to the West. That's the kind of person you are, Habib.
Some compelling points raised there live on the People's Voice. We've got two questions in 5 minutes, and this normally happens. But restorative justice in relation to fees must fall. Sipho's just spoken about, let's go to court. Sheena, I want to start with you. Restorative justice, can it work for fees must fall? Thobani, I want to ask you, do we need a truth, justice, and reconciliation commission? And then we'll come to Sipho on the same question in terms of restorative justice. Sheena, let's start with you.
Shabnam, I think restorative justice is the only justice because it asks the tough questions, it gets to the truth, accountability, and very importantly, reparations. So we need a justice that restores, not that asks who did what wrong and how should we punish them, but let's look at what's wrong and restore them to a place of dignity. The high point of justice, Shabnam, is that everyone has what they need, and that is that is a stark reality in South Africa. The majority of South Africans do not have what they need. And we're not going to get anywhere with the likes of Adam Habib at the helm of WITS University, producing doctors and lawyers that are not going to understand what real justice is, which is everyone has what they need. And we start there, and restorative justice is the only way to really address that, because discursive, it comes out of a conversation where everyone that needs to be at the table is at the table.
Absolutely. Thobani, do we need a truth, justice and reconciliation commission? Is that the only way to get all of the truth out and get some form of justice?
I think the Peace Must Fall movement has always, what you call, provided all in UCT, right? I remember in UCT, comrades there had came up with what was called the Sheckville TRC Commission, or the Sheckville Commission. Of course,
yeah.
If you really want to understand what happened around 54, and of course, even understanding what is happening in the higher education sector going forward, we will need something like that. But of course, on the other side, I'm tired of commissions. I'm tired of commissions that waste money and have no direction of where they want to go. This country simply needs to do what needs to be done. Break away from neoliberal capitalism, right? Break away from white supremacy oriented states and a state of living. We don't need to talk too much. All answers to our problems have been provided before, not today. I mean,
we are clear, Thobani. I'm going to ask you to pause there. We've got 3 minutes, 2 minutes now. Sipho, 30 seconds. Restorative justice in relation to Peace Must Fall. Can it work?
Yeah, no, we absolutely need restorative justice to deal with, the atrocities that were committed against young people, particularly by academics, the role that was played by academics and so on. However, we need to be careful in terms of how that commission is set up, because we know what happened with the TRC. Now, I hear Thulima Donsela talking about the TRC for economic crimes. It's not gonna work unless it's driven by the people. Look at the Land Commission. It keeps going back and asking people the same question, even though people have spoken to say, to declare what they want, but government still keeps going to make what Thobani was saying.
All right. I want to move to the last question now in the last 2 minutes, which is, lockdown has decimated. Lockdowns decimated the already very limited earning capacity of the poor to middle class debt slaves. Will we see a reactivation of Peace Must Fall ahead of inevitable issues with registration, res, food, and safety, especially for women students? Thobani, let's start with you. 30 seconds. Thobani, can you hear us?
I couldn't hear your question, sorry.
All right. Prediction. I've got a minute to go. Yes or no? Might we see a reactivation of Peace Must Fall ahead of the inevitable issues that will resurrect again in 2021?
I don't know how serious we are in this country currently about justice, about liberation, and about revolution, and about challenging this new dawn, about this neoliberal state. I don't know how serious we are. So I can't predict.
All right, we've lost Thobani there. Sipho, prediction. Might we see a reactivation of Peace Must Fall in 2021?
Look, our young kids are seeing, I'm not saying it will be in 2021, but at some stage, there is a lot of simmering anger at these inequalities. Young people can see, that they are being let down. Until they do something themselves, nothing is going to change. The same thing happened in 1976. The 1976 student uprising was the one that resuscitated the struggle that was dormant at the time. So the young kids will be again the one who bring about radical economic change in this country, because they are at the brunt of oppression.
Activation of Peace Must Fall.
Sorry, was that question to me? Yes. Well, we're already seeing a lot of lingering problems from fees must fall in terms of lingering fee exclusions, accommodation problems, and we're seeing new problems associated with inequities regarding the lockdown, distance learning, etc., and access to learning that way. So I think we are going to see possibly a renewed movement that addresses living problems and also new problems. I think they are there. I don't know what format that might take, but we certainly being consulted in those matters still.
Well, given what's happened with COVID-19 lockdown and what's being revealed to the majority of this country, some of whom for the very first time, we might see some solidarity with the Fees Must Fall movement. Let's see. I want to say a big thank you to our three guests for joining us today on The People's Voice. Sipho, Singiswa, Thobani, Zikalala, and Sheena saying Clair, Jonker. Thank you for joining us on The People's Voice, and thank you for being a voice of the people.
Thank you, and thank you, Thobani. Thank you, Sheena.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
All right, we've been in conversation on a very important topic, and of course, that's Fees Must Fall. In the second half of the show, we're not going to have time for an ad break, it looks like it. We're going to be in conversation with Latashia, Naidoo, Selvan, Naidoo, and Sheena saying Clair, Jonker again. My apologies. She's going to be replacing Zandile Qono-Reddy on the second part of the show, where we're talking about, is indenture a disguised, sanitized, or blatant form of slavery? What's our global understanding of slavery anyway now? And what do we do about reparations? Can we make it happen? So let's welcome into studio for the second half of the show, Latashia Naidoo, who is a journalist and an investigative journalism fellow, Selvan Naidoo, who is the curator of the 1860 Heritage Center, as well as, welcome back, Sheena Clair Jonker, restorative justice lawyer. Latashia Naidoo, welcome to The People's Voice.
Thank you for having me, Shabnam.
Sheena, thank you on short notice for joining us on the second half of the show today.
Thank you so much, Shabnam. I hope that I can contribute.
I'm sure you will. Social justice issues, are you very familiar with? Sadiq, I'm going to ask you to try and get hold of Selvan just to see where he is so he can join in on the conversation. I think you've got his number. But let's begin the conversation.
Shabnam, I'm sorry to interrupt. I've just spoken with Selvan. There's been a death and with regard to someone who's part of the 1860 Heritage Center, and he sends his profuse apologies that he's not going to be able to join the panel at this very moment.
All right, I've just seen the message on the 1860 group. The late Satish Dupelia has transitioned to the other side. And the messages say he's honored and kept his great-grandfather's legacy alive from a very young age. He will be sorely missed by the center and his wide circle of family and friends. And there's a number of messages. Selvan, of course, quite devastated as well. Satish was very much loved by many, many people and lived his life for peace and for social cohesion, particularly in KZN, but around the country as well. So he will be really, really very much missed. And we pray that he, of course, rests in peace. I want to read one more message from the Clair State CPF. It is with a sad and heavy heart that we bid farewell to one of our selfless, dedicated members, Mr. Satish Dupelia, from the Sydenham Sherwood CPF, who has passed away peacefully today. A remarkable soul doing good work for humanity. He will be sorely missed. From our Clair State CPF and affiliates, we would like to extend our heartfelt condolences to the Dupelia family. May the Almighty grant the dearly departed soul peace, and may his family attain the strength and courage during this difficult period. God bless them all. And that, I believe, is from Mr. Aku, from the chairperson of the Clair State CPF. Satish, we will miss you, but we know that you will find peace where you are in the universe. All right, somber start to the show, but perhaps some context. You know, more of us are leaving this earthly plane, and many of us come from this history of 1860, and these are topics that still need to be addressed and discussed. before we lose even more of us on the earthly plane. So what I want to ask Sadiq to do with us first is to play the BBC clip. And I know it's ironic playing a BBC clip considering the role of the British in colonizing our country. But there's a reason that I want to show this clip before we move on to our conversation. Sadiq?
In the early 19th century, Britain was the most powerful nation on earth. Her colonies stretched from the Caribbean to the South Pacific. This was the largest empire the world had ever seen. But there is a lost chapter to that imperial history, the story of over 1 million people who were secretly enslaved and transported to the farthest shores of the British Empire. Shipped under agreements that they could neither read nor understand, they didn't know where they were going, and most of them never made it home. Yet what was one of the largest movements of people in the 19th century has now been almost completely forgotten. It is a story of greed, injustice and the abuse of power, a story which implicates those at the very highest level of successive British governments.
All right, a very compelling clip there from the BBC. So let's move to our first question. Latashia, you've recently published an article based on your research on the realities of the 1860s. So here's the question. Is indentured labor a disguised, sanitized, or blatant form of slavery?
Shabnam, I've been having this discussion online and with academics in real life, and there's no disguising the fact that indenture was a form of slavery. It was a form of debt bondage, which the UN now recognizes as a form of slavery. And no matter how we sugarcoat the narrative, it was premised on the fact that people were commodities. But I do think that with regard to the question of whether or not it was slavery, it's open to interpretation. If we take, for example, Hugh Tinker, who wrote a seminal work on indenture, he described indenture as a new system of slavery. But academics of late have questioned the definition of slavery. If we look at indenture, there was an impermanence to it, whereas there was a perpetuality to slavery. And the definition of slavery speaks to debt bondage of the indenture contract, which it is. So there's contradicting statements of whether or not indenture was slavery. But if you ask the descendants of indentured laborers, they're going to say, yes, it was. It was a form of humiliation. The violence was systemic. It was a form of humiliation and displacement, a loss of earth and health and home and identity. And it stripped people of their very basic human rights because of the atrocities of the violence of these crimes, which indentured endured on a daily basis.
Absolutely on point. Now, the question I was going to ask Selvan is his view as an 1860 Heritage Center curator who is committed to decolonizing history. Of course, the colonialists tell us it's indentured labor, it's not slavery, and then we swallow it and say, yeah, it's indentured labor, it's not slavery. It's the same as, you know, the apartheid government saying it's not apartheid, it's just race classification, you know, a euphemism for what it actually is. And the horror stories related to 1860 are so many that we'd never be able to get through them on a single show. But just for example, pregnant women had to work until they were 7 months pregnant. And for the last 2 months of their pregnancy, they were not given any food until they came back to slavery, right? Then, of course, there's the rapes of women, which occurred on the ships that were arriving to Natal, as it was called then. They were the rapes when they got here from the Sirdars, the other Indians who were, you know, lording over them. It's a system of hierarchy that was created deliberately. And of course, the landlords of these properties. So we cannot, by any stretch of imagination, you're right, Latashia, sugarcoat what is in fact in every way means and forms slavery. Sheena, I want to talk about the legalities of this, because in that BBC clip, very clearly, we had them say, these people did not read nor understand the terms of these agreements, these new agreements that were created as, to mask slavery. They didn't understand them. There was fraud involved because they were told, you're coming here to be rich and be given all this food and maybe given a property and this freedom in this new exciting land. So there was fraud, right, on the way here and when they were here. Then there was coercion, and I use inverted commas because certainly coercion is another euphemism. It was violent, genocidal even in many ways. Does this fraud and coercion negate lawful consent? And the reason I ask this question is, if consent is negated because there was fraud and violence, including being forced to watch the hangings of your family, then surely the agreements were not legally valid.
Consent doesn't
Which brings
exist.
us back to the fact that the agreement was not valid. Therefore, again, they were slaves. Your thoughts?
There was no agreement. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there are various degrees of volition and consent. And to my mind, only full, free volition and consent creates a value. If you need to read things through circumstances and even the whatever was going to happen at the end of the indenture agreement often didn't happen. So when you asked at the beginning, was this sanitized slavery? Was it blatant? This was blatant slavery, blatant slavery, except to slaves then.
Sorry, just struggling to hear you there.
Their own slavery, aren't they?
Yeah, of course.
They entered into these agreements.
You signed the agreement, therefore you're not a slave, you're actually part of indentured labor, but you don't know what you signed. There was fraud involved and there's violence. Yeah, we lost quite a bit of that. Do you want to just round up your thoughts from a legal perspective, Sheena? Because I think this is so central to this debate on indenture versus slavery.
Would not have been intact, and therefore
all right, I think we're just battling with Sheena's connectivity there. Sheena, are you back? All right, Latashia, let's get your comments. You've heard me unpack this, the legal aspects of these so-called contracts. The fraud, the coercion means there was not consent. If there was not consent, the agreement was not valid. If the agreement was not valid, another reason why we call it slavery. Your thoughts?
I think that the indentured, they were of lower castes back in India, and the recruitment processes, as we know, were very shady, they were very speculative, and the indentured, many of them were lured to South Africa with false promises of gold growing on chili trees and streets paved with gold. And I think that with regard to that, the false promises, these are illiterate people who were unaware of the legalities with regard to the contracts that they were being entered into. But there's been so much argument of late that with regard to slavery versus indenture, the indentured had agencies. They had access to legal resources if they were to complain about abuses by the Sidars or by the colonial masters. And because the colonial masters provided these recourses for them, there's also been justification that, okay, it wasn't slavery because slaves didn't have free will, they didn't have the option to seek legal aid for punishments or for any crimes. So the debate is going to be ongoing, and I suppose it all depends on your understanding of the real atrocities of what indenture entailed in its entirety. Like I said earlier, we can't sugarcoat the fact that these people endured the most extreme forms of violence, and they entered into this contract on very false pretenses. And many of them they never read their contracts. they simply printed their thumbprints on the document. So they didn't even sign the documents that they were signing over for the next 5 to 10 years of their lives. So that's something that needs to be questioned as well.
Absolutely agree with you. And there is an article that was written by Selvan Naidoo and Kiru Naidoo last year. And it really speaks to the violence, particularly by the sugar barons. And I'm just trying to call that article up so we can get into it and address some of the questions that we'd had for Selvan. And it should be up quite shortly. But meanwhile, let's move on from there. Latashia, there were an explosion of comments to your article. I mean, a lot of them were absolutely in solidarity and saying to you, thank you for re-emphasizing our lived experience, and that being from South Africans of Indian origin. And then there were also other people from other groups, if you want to call it that, who said we never knew any of this. And then there were others who said, no, you're talking rubbish, this couldn't have happened, it wasn't that bad. Tell us about this variety of responses that you received to your article and your research.
So my investigative research was on the atrocities of indenture crimes in colonial Natal, and it was essentially a retelling of historically documented crimes. So I spent months doing this research, sourcing documents from the Pietermaritzburg Archives Repository, from Pretoria, going through tons of documents at the Keely Campbell Library and UKZN's Gandhi Lutuli Documentation Centre. So everything that I published was based on historically documented facts. And going into this, before I published my thesis or the article which appeared in the Sunday Tribune last Sunday, I knew there'd be legal and ethical issues. But I assumed it would be from the descendants of the sugar barons who were now refuting the claims of abuse, which I was writing about and bringing to contemporary resonance and putting out in the public sphere. But it was actually the social media trolls who decided to rip my piece to shreds. And the objective of the piece was to inform and educate and to allow people, especially South Africans of Indian descent, to reclaim our history by giving it contemporary resonance. Because the story of indenture, I mean, its exclusion from our history textbooks is so telling. It's an omission of our own turbulent colonial past that's now been relegated to oral histories and living memories. So I decided to write about a small percentage of some of the documented indenture era crimes. And I was not prepared for the backlash. I was accused of race baiting, of deliberately sowing discord. I was told that my article was fake news. And I was told that I was creating racial tensions. A lot of people completely refuted the fact that indenture ever existed, simply because it was something that they didn't know about. And unfortunately, the story, which was a historical retelling and was so significant, being in the 160th year of the first indenture arrivals to South Africa, became a race issue. And as upsetting as it was, I do realize now that it actually got people talking. And the whole point of this was to have a re-education of the past. So I'm hoping that those people who have questioned whether or not indenture existed will actually take some time to actually read my article, and those of Selvan Naidoo's and Kiru Naidoo's and all the other prolific writers who have been bringing the story of indenture to the fore in this 160th year. I hope that they would educate themselves, because ignorance is not bliss. You can't deny an entire people's history simply because it's something you're not aware of.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. Race is always a very sensitive topic, to put it mildly, in our country. So any attempt to correct the colonial narrative is always met by, a lot of opposition. And that's partly because we were divided in that particular way. So most people just don't even know. And clearly there's a lot of work to do. But when I hear about, the indentured, the secret slaves, I prefer to call it that, being called human cargo by those that brought them here, certainly there is no debate in my mind about what really happened. But clearly there needs to be more education in our schools as a start, but we'll get to that topic in a bit. Sheena, what are your thoughts on a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission addressing what happened prior to 1860 and what happened after 1860 and the impact thereof? I mean, do you think there's any value in that? I mean, I see that the ANC led government is now saying that they should, the apartheid deaths that happened, the murders that happened, you know, there needs to be resolution, and that all of the activists that were murdered, there needs to be resolution. These cases have not been investigated. Files have gone missing. I mean, I've had Imtiaz Kaji on the show talking about the murder of his uncle Ahmed Timur, etc., and the families that are living with this trauma. Similarly, there are families and descendants of the 1800 slaves and prior who are still living with that trauma. So talk to us about your thoughts on the value of a Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, firstly, and secondly, how would we go about making this happen? I think you're on mute, Sheena.
I keep forgetting to turn my mic back. I think the work of retelling of history in the way that that my fellow guest is doing is absolutely central. And Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a great deal of value, but we've got to be careful that they are victim-centric rather than perpetrator-centric, because the TRC has tended to get a bad rap because so many perpetrators kind of got away without being truthful, without making amends and that kind of thing, but pressed in a victim-centric way. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think it's the only way we can get to justice, actually. Can I read you something that a friend of mine sent? It's a colleague called Gresham. He did, I don't know where he gets this from, maybe you know it, but he says, the ferociously high incidence of suicides on the Reynolds estate, now owned by Lova Sugar, ought to have provoked extreme concern by the authorities. Over a period of almost 25 years, reports of assaults, desertions, deaths and suicides poured from the Reynolds estates in the Mzunto district. Now they're descendants of these people. There's generational trauma. On our mediation training program, we're talking recently about epigenetics and how trauma can change the DNA in human beings for generations to come. We have to address this stuff. We have to go back. We have to correct history, and then we have to do something about it. We don't, it doesn't have to be punitive in that we're not out to destroy the humans. We are to destroy the evil that humans commit. And I honestly believe that Truth and Reconciliation practiced properly through the eyes of the victim primarily can really get us further down the road. And a retelling of history in the way that's been done is so crucial to this, and this needs to filter through to our schools. Our schools are still too Eurocentric, Christocentric. I'm a Christian myself, but it's not the only religion, is it? It's not the only religion. Why do
Absolutely.
people from
that
other faiths have to feel so excluded?
Okay, I'm hearing some feedback from the background there, but you're quoting from the exact article that I wanted Selvan to take us through, which was published last year, and is called Justice for Indentured Indians Remains Elusive, and it's by Selvan and Kiru Naidoo, and we'll get into it in a bit. We've got a comment from Caitlin Chessie, who's just done an exhibition. She's an artist, right? She's just done an exhibition on 1860, and it's very powerful and compelling. And she says, indenture was only addressed in my education when I was in my second year of university. It went so far that another student asked me how or why Indian people are in South Africa. I believe we need our primary schools and high schools to introduce it in our everyday conversation about South African history. Let's address that point then before we go back specifically to what happened on the Reynolds estate, which is a very important point to raise. There are a lot of people online who are saying they don't know. Interestingly, I saw a comment by someone named Karen, which is, you know, that trope. And Karen said, I didn't know this. I wish I'd known this. Why wasn't it in our history books? What are your thoughts on how we get this into the curriculum? Latashia, let's start with you.
I think for so long, the history that we're taught in school has been taught through a white heteropatriarchal lens. And the story of Indenture has always been associated with the Gandhi narrative. But the story of Indenture is so much more than just one man. It's the story of 152,184 individuals who crossed the Kalapani to come to this foreign land and start a new life here. And it's heartbreaking that it's been omitted from our South African history, because the story of Indenture is a South African story. And Selvan has just contributed to a book about the Indian Africans. And I'm a sixth generation descendant of indentured laborers. And it's something I'm extremely proud of. But prior to me embarking on my research project, I knew nothing about my own indentured history. And it's not a failure on my parents' parts, I think, or my grandparents. I think that there's still a lot of shame attached to the whole indenture narrative within the Indian community. And it's because indenture was a system that was deeply humiliating. It stripped people of identity, of their basic human rights. And as a very proud ethnic group, I think Indians have been responsible for forgetting our own history as a way of preserving ourselves. But with regard to the whole debate about why this is not taught in our curriculums, I know that activists have for years been trying to champion the cause. There's been discussions with the Department of Arts and Culture to introduce this into our curriculum, because people just don't know about indenture. And I understand why people on social media are saying, we've never heard of this. I understand why they're denouncing the history, because people just assume that Indians arrived here and became thriving members of society and contributed to the social and economic fabric of South Africa in every way. But no one's questioned our past. And like I said, it's a past that's associated with Gandhi, but so much more than just one man. But we need to be having these discussions.
Let's link it back to... Sorry, Latashia, do you want to round off your thought there?
Yes, we need to be having these discussions. We need to be questioning our own indentured history and how that associates with our South African identities, because you can't ignore the past. As much as we're living in 2020, in the 21st century, it's a huge part of our identities, which we've been very myopic about.
I want to talk to you about identity as well, because it's such an important question. But Sheena, let's link this conversation with the one we've just had on decolonized education. Isn't this evidence, right, that our education is still colonized, the fact that such important histories that originated and happened in our country are not in our textbooks, and are, you know, leading to this racial division in our country, preventing the kind of solidarity that we need to overcome what it is that we face? What are your thoughts?
Well, history has traditionally been written by the violent and the conquerors, hasn't it? So we need a new era of telling the story. Testimony in court is telling the story truthfully, open-heartedly. We can reclaim the story in the way that is being done now by going back, researching and rewriting that story. So we need to reclaim storytelling as a tradition, so that it's not left in the hands of the conquerors and the winners and the violent. Because if you get to tell someone else's story, that's how you can oppress them. And as Chimamanda Adichie, I think she quoted the Palestinian poet who said, what the conquerors do is that... Just a moment. Sorry about that, Siri. What the conquerors do is that they start with a secondly. They start with the secondly part of the story. So they start with the arrows of the Native Americans instead of the arrival of the British. They start with the failed state instead of the settler colonial state. So it's very important to reclaim that tradition of storytelling and to be able to tell our own stories. And that's a wonderful thing that your guest is doing to reclaim that storytelling. And I think a decolonized education breaks down the walls between institutions and communities. So there are open spaces between schools and universities and institutions and communities, and we can kind of merge the learning, and we can create open doorways and revolving doors for the various traditions to become merged into the way that we learn. And again, the Black Lives Matter movement, the modern day abolitionist movements are saying abolish education in its current format, along with abolish the police, etc., in its current format. And it's saying, what if teachers saw themselves as healers? What if police saw themselves as healers? What if lawyers saw themselves as healers? What if doctors saw themselves as healers? So the modern day abolitionist movement is crucial. And I think we are going to see a decolonized education emerging, and it's going to be in all our best interests.
Absolutely, and we're going to have to make that happen because power, gives up nothing without demand, and we need to get these stories into, from preschool level, so that we build that solidarity between us that is engineered to be missing. Because when we don't know each other's stories, then we can't relate to each other. And I really think it's diabolical the way it has been engineered in this particular way. There were comments online. I mean, there was just thousands of comments and discussions going on around 1860 and debates and, suffering Olympics. My suffering was worse than your suffering, etc., etc., which was kind of painful to see, but that's only because we don't really know each other's stories. And there were South Africans of Indian origin who completely rejected the word indenture based on their family's history, which included suicides related to the abuse, the dehumanization, the starvation, etc. And I do think that if some of those people were to get into debates with those who argue for indenture to remain the lens through which we see what happened instead of slavery, that it would get really heated up because these are people's lived experience. Latashia, what are your thoughts on South Africans of Indian origins rejecting the word indenture? And these are not academics, but these are people who see beyond that frame and say, it's not indenture, it was slavery. Do not insult our ancestors that way.
Look, I think it is, like I mentioned previously, open to interpretation. But if you actually interrogate the facts and you go to the basic definition of what slavery is, indenture was akin to slavery in every way, shape, or form. It was a decommissioned form of slavery. And I think that the pain that's associated with our indentured identity has sort of transcended from generation to generation. And we need to own our identities. We need to reclaim the term coolie, which was a racial slur, and has been used as a racial slur against Indians, South Africans of Indian descent for generations. But you can't denounce an entire history. Indenture existed, it happened, and we're the products of that lived experience. You spoke about the suicides with regard to indenture, and if one were to walk into the 1860 Heritage Center in Greyville, which Selvan is curator of, you're met with these giant sepia-tone portraits of these long dead indentured laborers, which occupy pride of place on the walls of the center. And the pictures are so confronting. It's the eyes of these long dead indentured laborers, which are so soulless, and the pain behind them is so reflective of countless untold traumas. And these are faceless, nameless people who are actually our forebearers. And it's about time we actually acknowledge that indenture was a form of perpetual despair for them. But we should also feel so proud of what they were able to overcome and achieve, and create a foundation for the privilege that we live and experience today.
Absolutely. Sheena, I want to talk about agency for a bit, because, you know, there's some arguments that say by calling it slavery, we're taking away the agency of people who chose to come here. But they didn't come here because they actually just happily wanted to come here. I'm not talking about the merchants. I'm talking about, you know, the lower class, poor, right? They came here because it was horrendous in India and they thought it was going to be better here, and then arrived here to see, well, actually, this is an equal or if not worse nightmare to what they were experiencing. So in fact, there was no real agency. But connected to that is this thought of the sanitization that happens, in the sense of when people say to a sexual assault victim, well, you know, it was sexual assault, but it wasn't rape, you know, or it was sex with a minor, but it wasn't rape, right? Do we get to tell people that about their experiences, Sheena?
No, we don't. When it comes to agency, we've got to be very careful that we call, when we say people have agency, they must be operating with their full legal capacity. Their capacity mustn't be diminished in any way. They must have their full volition intact. And I think of the case, which is often the same argument is used with sex workers. Well, you know, they want to be there, or people in the porn industry, they've chosen to be there. No, if you go and examine were those individuals' agency intact, in the sense that they were operating from a perspective of full volition, not diminished by drugs, not diminished by alcohol, not diminished by desperation, not diminished by poverty. All of these things can diminish our agency. So we have to, when we talk consent and we talk volition, consent must be informed consent. Volition must be free and voluntary. We don't volunteer to do something on the back of some massive reward or punishment. That's not true volition, is it?
Absolutely agree with you. Critical
Reward
to the discussion, and I certainly think that women have so much to contribute. Sorry, Sheena, there seems to be a delay in the transmission there. All right, so I do think there's a lot of space available for women to be writing and talking about these particular subjects. Sheena, we've got a delay with you. I'm not sure if you're as near to your Wi-Fi as possible, but I want to get into this article written by Selvan and Naidoo last year, Justice for Indentured Indians Remains Elusive. And it really is a searing read. And I want to touch on the second part of it, which says, critical to remembering, reflecting, and restoring human dignity in a country tortured by colonial and apartheid violence is a need for acknowledgement of the evils committed by the colonial planters and their heirs. Atonement and accountability for gross human rights violations against Indian indentured laborers or indentured Indians remains elusive. Over the last 159 years, no single colonial planter nor any of their descendants have offered an apology, with a litany of murder, rape, torture, and other forms of violence meted out to indentured Indians. It's common cause that the gross human rights abuses on the plantations were harrowingly sadistic. Amongst the starkest was on the plantations of it was a horror movie, high incidence of suicide. Of course, the Reynolds plantations are now owned by Ilovo Sugar, Over a period of 25 years, reports of assaults, desertions, deaths, and suicide poured from the Reynolds sugar estate in the Umzinto era. And of course, there was a conspiracy of silence on the part of the officials. There was a coolie commission which prevented flogging. Gee, thank you very much. But of course, violent exploitation of human labor to realize maximum profit was fundamental to the way Reynolds and his sons ran their plantations. And, you know, the article really talks about a doctor was only summoned if the patient was dangerously ill. Otherwise, you had to walk 14 kilometers. 9 hours of work was extended to 13 hours a day. You couldn't really use the toilet. I spoke about pregnant women, food rations, issues, double shifts, housing conditions, dying of exposure during winter, etc. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and it's so traumatic. And then the article talks about the Rhodes Must Fall protest movement. It saw the removal of Cecil John Rhodes statue in UCT in 2015, you know, drawing again the solidarity with the previous conversation that we have. And they talk about places like the clubhouse at Ndoni Golf Club, where frames of the Reynolds legacy are so proudly displayed, and should start to do some introspection and atonement for past evil. These portraits must fall. The very estate where the Reynolds ruled is today transformed into a beautiful wedding venue named Linton Hall, with these ornate drawing rooms behind which lurk a shameful past. So it's this violent history, and the heirs have said absolutely nothing. They've refused to acknowledge, they've refused to engage, they've refused reparations, and we'll get to reparations. But I want to talk to you specifically about accountability and restorative justice before we talk about reparations. Sheena, what are your thoughts on a TJRC? I mean, do you think it might work with the Reynolds? Do you think if we invited them to a TJRC commission or to mediation that they would 160 years accept the invitation? And how do we get them to do that?
Talking about, sorry, I've got very bad connection here. I'm not sure.
Sheena, can you move closer to the Wi-Fi source? Are you using a Wi-Fi connection? I can hear you now.
Yes, I'm as close as possible to it. I'm actually on Zoom every day, and it's normally very good, but I think we've got very bad weather headed our way, so we must just be happy. Are you talking about the descendants of Reynolds coming to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Yes, absolutely. The Reynolds and others like them. I mean, there's been no accountability, no apology, no acknowledgement.
I'm sorry,
they and continue to make profits. And I know there's been a call to boycott the sugar that arises from these heirs of these plantations. And I think it's a good call. You know, it's aligned with the BDS movement of the Palestinians, for example. It's amazing how solidarity just pulls together.
Sometimes people are not ready to table, and some other form of action is appropriate. Some other form of disruptive action, because if people are kind of comfortable where they're at, and you know, there's no real need to go to a commission like this, then some sort of disinvestment or disruptive economic action might be what's needed to bring them to the table. And from there we can talk, as long as everyone is committed to open-hearted talking and open-hearted listening, so that we can get to truth, accountability, and reparations, which is what this country desperately needs. And I'm talking the descendants of those who have been oppressed in the various different forms and formats, and who still carry that legacy of oppression within them at an economic level, as I say, at an epigenetic level. I think that is something that we need to look into, and we certainly as a network are starting to pay some attention to that kind of thing. But I do think I think restorative justice is really the only way, but it's got to be, it's got to lose the reputation of being the soft approach. It's actually the tough approach. It's not a violent approach, but it's a tough approach. The violent approach is the soft approach. It's easy to be violent. It's easy to crush people with violence. It's easy to make problems go away with violence. Restorative justice is the authentic, truthful, the truth will set you free approach. And we all need it. Whether we come from the oppressor class or the oppressed class, we all need it.
Of course, there's no healing and progress without it. Latashia, would you like to add to that what Sheena has just spoken about in terms of restorative justice, mediation, the descendants of these heirs who have no accountability for what has happened?
You know, Shabnam, no retelling of the indentured traumas is complete without mentioning the notorious Reynolds Brothers estate, which for decades there's been documented histories of desertions, suicides, and death rates on the Reynolds Brothers Krifa and Mzinto estates, which far exceeded those on other estates. And Illovo Sugar now owns what was formerly the Reynolds Brothers estates. And I tried for months on end to try to get some sort of comment or acknowledgement to my media queries, to my investigative research queries from Illovo Sugar. I physically went to the building and was escorted out at one point. And with regard to the Hewletts, the Changal Hewletts family as well.
Sorry, Latashia, just rewind there. You went with them as part of your research for this article, and
Yes.
you were physically escorted out.
Yeah, I was told I was trespassing. So they refused
clearly
to.
having a conversation that is quite critical and going to upset some people. But Latashia, just to rewind, you were escorted out. You went there for your research to interview, get some information, and you were physically escorted out.
Yes, I was told I was trespassing. But with regard to Illovo, there's been silence on their part. With regard to the Hewletts family, which Changat Hewletts, it was an amalgamation of the Hewlett farms in the 1960s. And I got a very brief comment from John Hewlett, who's one of the descendants, who basically told me he can't give me any comments on the family's indentured their association to indenture, because he wasn't there, his family weren't there, the current generation, so they're not willing to discuss this on any platform or with anyone. And I thought that was really telling of this omission of their own family's involvement in what made them so wealthy over generations, yet they're now denouncing this history. There's absolutely no mention of indenture on either the Illovo Sugar or the Hewlett's websites as well, yet there's detailed histories of their humble beginnings. So that leads to more questions about why don't you want to acknowledge this when it happened? And these families grew wealthy on the backbreaking work of the indentured laborers who earned a pittance in comparison to the billions. I mean, the sugar industry in South Africa currently is estimated to be around 14 billion rand. And it's a figure that we can't comprehend in the 21st century. I can't imagine indentured laborers in the late 1800s and early 1900s having to grasp that number. But hopefully someday there will be atonement, there will be acknowledgement. And I think the main reason for me embarking on my research was to bring contemporary resonance to the topic of indenture, but also to get some sort of accountability from these descendants. I mean, there's been decades of documented abuses, and saying that you went there because this happened before you were born is actually an easy way out. If we were to imagine what things would be like now, if we were to transplant the experiences of the indentured in colonial Natal to the 21st century, which is now an era of immense social justice and technological advancement, this would no doubt inspire massive local and global backlash at the atrocities, and there'd be such an outcry at the sheer litany of human rights violations. And over and above the significant media coverage of the abuses, there'd be a slew of social media campaigns marches and protests, and there'd be calls for reforms and reparations, and most importantly, accountability on the part of the descendants of these perpetrators and the descendants who are now having to deal with these past issues of the guilty, but they would be held to public and legal scrutiny and made answerable for their crimes. And I do think that this needs to be done. The crimes of indenture are horribly sadistic, and it reads, gosh, it's actually a really emotional read if you were to actually dig into what the story of indenture is, which was basically profits prioritizing human rights, and it's heartbreaking. And there should be some sort of accountability, like there was with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that dealt with apartheid era crimes. So the question is why? Why is indenture now such a forgotten part of history? And why is there no accountability? And why are there no talks of reparations at all by politicians?
Well, because capitalism is not going to account. They have too much to lose. And the fact that they're not even willing to have this conversation makes me wonder whether they've learned anything. And what about the workers currently working for them? What are their employment experiences like? And it's certainly something that needs to be looked into, because if you will not even admit that what happened was wrong, you will not even come to the table and have this conversation, then you've not learned anything. And we have to look at perhaps what workers are still going through, working with people that still have this kind of mindset. All right, we've got 2 more questions and about 8 minutes to go. In your opinion, having discussed the slavery of the 1860, we've talked about Black Lives Matter, we've spoken about BDS as a mechanism that Free Palestine uses. Is the global understanding of slavery evolving past these divide and conquer definitions? And how important is it to solidarity across the struggles of the oppressed? Sheena?
I'm not too sure whether it's an evolved slavery back then. What we still do you know what I'm saying? If we do something to one part of the body, we do it to the whole body. And in the same way, whatever we do to humanity, we do to the whole of humanity. Now, that destruction has got to go somewhere. It's here. It's still with us today. It's still with us today. And I don't think there's an evolved enough understanding of the devastating effects that slavery and unfree labor systems and whatever you call it, and exploitative labor systems today that emerged out of all of that still has an effect on our world, and we all have to deal with the fallout of that, whether we are on the side of privilege, on the wrong side of privilege. Ultimately, we all deal with that, and I'm not. Look, I think we're far from being there, but I think that the conversations we're having like this, the movements that are emerging, are taking us. I often say that I feel like Black Lives Matter and the abolitionist movements are moving us towards a unique portal for healing in this world. So I think it's happening, and I think these conversations are part of that. And the more of us that go along on this, there's healing for us all. There's healing for us all. The oppressed need healing as well. Being an oppressor is not good for the soul, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Latashia, we've got about 5 minutes to go. Do you think, based on the context of our discussion and examples, for example, of the Black Lives Matter recognizing that incarcerated Black Americans in prison performing labor for a pittance of payment is slavery, right? So do you believe that the global understanding of slavery is evolving, and how important is that for solidarity internationally?
Shabnam, the United Nations has declared debt bondage, which indenture was. as a new form of slavery. And that form of debt bondage is happening around the world, in the Philippines, in the US, in Mexico. It's happening everywhere. So I think as our understanding of indenture and slavery begins to expand, we also see the evolution of the definition of the term itself. And there's no denying that indenture was akin to slavery in every way, but these are discussions that we need to be having. We need to bring the topic to the fore, and we need to ask important questions in order to evolve our understanding of what it was, and also to prevent something like this from happening once again. Indenture was a system that was premised supposedly on free will, but it was anything but. And that definition has sort of been carried through 4 generations by academics and historians. And we need to change that. We need to change that by creating an awareness of what indenture wasn't. And indenture wasn't freedom. Indenture was bondage of the human spirit, of the mind. It brought about despair and pain and longing. And we see that happening in modern day in different forms, not of the indenture that we're aware of with regard to the colonial itself, but in other countries and in terms of where there's debt for one's services and freedom is premised on that repayment of debt. So these are conversations that need to be had. And as the definition of slavery begins to evolve, so should our understanding of what indenture actually entails.
Absolutely agree with you. All right, we've got about 3 minutes to go for the last question, and it's a big one. Reparations, right? Actual compensation, reparations for the suffering endured, again, euphemism, suffering of the 1860 and prior secret slavery that was used. What are your thoughts? I mean, obviously, I'm sure you agree that reparations are necessary. But what are your thoughts on how we can actually make that happen? Because we seem to be stuck. That needle has not moved. There's no admission or acknowledgement. How do we get to reparations? Sheena, let's start with you and we'll give the last word to Latashia.
Well, I think we need to first start with more conscious reparations, and isn't it? I think we need to start with understanding why we need reparations, and when we help people to understand, that's how we get buy-in, don't we? And I think once we have a buy-in from humanity to say, well, this stuff was wrong, and there are people living today that still are suffering the effects of having been colonized, having been bought or sold into slavery, having been subject to these indentured labor systems. I think once we've got that buy-in, we have to raise the consciousness of repair in this world as a collective humanity, and how it is good for us all. It's good. I've never met a perpetrator actually who, when having because I do restorative justice, so if I'm one-on-one with a perpetrator, I've never met someone, unless they're a complete sociopath or psychopath or whatever, and I don't normally deal with those, but I've never met someone that's harmed someone else. And that when you get them and you're having a one-on-one open-hearted situation that doesn't say, I want to make up for that, I want to make this right, I want to help this person heal, I don't want them to carry the cost of what I've done to them for the rest of their lives. I don't want to be that person. And I think if we have the right conversation.
Very powerful comments from you. We have only a minute left, and I've still got to say goodbye to everybody. Latashia, reparations, can we make it happen? And do you think it would work?
I think that reinvestigations of these past crimes are so necessary, and reopening of inquests into these colonial era crimes actually attempts to enforce restorative justice by placing accountability on the descendants of these sugar barons. But I think as the Indian community within South Africa, we need to move beyond that shame that's associated with indenture in order for restorative justice to become a thing, in order for us to actually reclaim our histories and give it contemporary resonance by making it prominent and asking questions and holding people accountable. And that's the only way we can move forward. But it's going to happen in this generation. That's something that we have to wait and see.
All right, I want to say a massive thank you to both our guests today, Latashia Naidoo, investigative journalist, as well as Sheena Sinclair Jonker, restorative justice lawyer, for joining us on The People's Voice and for being a voice of the people.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you to
wonderful to meet you, Latashia. Wonderful to be with you, Shabnam.
Thank you, Sheena. Thank you to all of our guests who've been on the show today. Sipho, Singiswa, Thobani, Zikalala, Sheena Sinclair Jonker, and Sheena Sinclair Jonker again, as well as Latashia Naidoo, our listeners, viewers, and the Salaamedia team. Let's remember to ask ourselves every day, what am I doing to make a difference in my community, my country, and my world? Until the next episode of The People's Voice, Revolutionary Peace. Assalamu alaikum.